At the G7 summit, leaders urged China to help end the war in Ukraine and at the same time reiterate their commitment to counter the Asian nations' growing global influence. How is this sort of confusing language supposed to inspire the trust of the citizens of the free world? And in India, the Congress party takes office in the southern state of Karnataka. Rahul Gandhi and the Congress's leadership invited a whole host of regional and national political parties to the event in a strong show of opposition unity. Has the campaign for the 2024 parliamentary elections in India well and truly gotten underway? These are the questions we're asking our reporters on this weekend episode of the Daily Debrief, coming to you from our studios here in New Delhi with me, Siddhantani. First up, the Japanese city of Hiroshima hosted the leaders of the Western industrialized nations belonging to the grouping known as the G7. The summit comes at a time when these countries, led of course by the United States, no longer call the shots without serious opposition from those in the rest of the world. The president of Ukraine attended the summit as well this time and met with individual leaders on the sidelines. Anish has the details and joins us now via video conference. Anish, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky arriving late to the summit. Clearly, he is the busiest of this group of very busy men, and also conspicuously the only one not wearing a suit at the event. But his country is at the center of a lot of conversation at the G7 summit. What is new? What kind of conversations, meetings did he have, and what is the G7's renewed sort of stance on sanctions on Russia?
Well, it's not necessarily a renewed stance when it comes to the sanctions part. The countries are basically just continuing what they've done for the past 2 years during the war and the conflict overall. But it's also the other part, like with how much attention Zelensky is getting from several media houses compared to what he's actually doing at the summit, which is pretty much nothing. At this point, there are headlines about how he's supposedly, quote unquote, confronting leaders who have supposedly enabled Russia, including India's Modi. But apart from like very empty statements from these leaders, he's really not getting any kind of substantial thing out of this whole endeavor. Maybe some couple of sanctions here and there, maybe some kind of, and obviously we always keep hearing about like bilateral arms deals, if not arms deals, but like arms aid, sort of charity that runs into billions when it comes to the United States even. And in none of so all of these things are going to continue. It is nothing remarkable in terms of what he's achieving for Ukraine or for his cause. However we look at the conflict, it is really there is literally no material gains out of his presence in the summit. But definitely Russia and the war was at the center of, among other things, was one of the central discussions, and it definitely gained certain attention. But we do not really see, like, apart from the whole gold importing sanctions, we really do not see much happening on this front, because if they want to really go into sanctions territory, there is very little they dare to do when it comes to something significant. And that is where this whole thing on how the West or the G7 countries view the war and how much they really support the so-called Ukrainian cause really just falls apart when you consider the fact that they're really not ready to make any sacrifices themselves, but like as the joke goes, they're ready to fight until the very last Ukrainian man. So that's how pretty much things are going at the moment.
After the foreign ministers meeting earlier in the year, Anish, we talked about the calls to denuclearize North Korea. This time, a lot of focus and reports coming in of statements from the Chinese embassy in Japan, talking about what it called negative kind of statements. There are reports that talk of countering Chinese economic coercion, while at the same time urging China to find a way to get Russia to end this war. So what is the whole China focus at the summit?
Well, obviously, for the G7, the real enemy is China, and at least at the summit. And it is very much so because China is far more successful in creating more successful groupings of economic blocks,
Mm,
be it the SEO, be it the BRICS, or any even in the G20, where China really has a bigger heft than it used to have, say, a couple of years ago.
mm,
So in this case, definitely containing China is pretty much what you see from the language that they talk about, where they talk about how they want to limit so-called economic coercion, which is basically comes in the form of loans or aid or trade deals. Trade deals. We have to very specifically point that out. Trade
mm,
deals being done between China and any small country or any country that is smaller than China, which is pretty much most of the world.
mm,
So in all of these cases, they see coercion when many of them have been masters of coercion themselves for very long. Even after the decolonization process, many of them have continued to take out capital, but that's besides the point. Nevertheless, they talk about coercion, but they really do not give anything substantial either here. But definitely, this shows that all of these countries agree to the fact that for them, uh, containing China is more important than anything else. And this is something, interestingly, they haven't talked about Taiwan, which is something quite interesting so far because, uh, like, Taiwan has always been, for at least the past 2 years that we have seen, has always been
mm,
used as this flashpoint for a new conflict. But the fact that it has not played that important a role in the current summit shows that probably they are not seeing anything valuable at that front. Probably maybe even with the chip wars, and they probably do not see any kind of conflict coming from, at least from the Chinese side, to the point where they can actually go into a full-fledged war. So they're looking probably at different avenues and using the so-called language of economic coercion as a means to do that. Uh, in the larger scheme of things, obviously, they see China as a possible negotiator with the Russian war in the Russia-Ukraine war. But obviously, their language is quite confused at the moment because they're basically threatening China for making trade deals that might be lucrative to itself, and whether or not it is, but or something that China, any other country would do when it comes to making trade deals on their own.
yeah.
But in this case, they're making threats for that, and then B, they want China to play an active role. It has been done previously as well. They want China to play an active role in supposedly containing North Korea, somehow thinking that all the levers of North Korea runs from Beijing.
Mm,
But yes, yeah, they do want the same to be done with Russia, but there is literally no roadmap to that, and definitely no kind of resolution in sight from their side on the current conflict. So if you look at the overall thing, it is a lot of bluster but with no substance. Because you also look at other issues that they're talking about, be it containing climate change or mitigating climate change for that matter,
mm,
or for that matter, the so-called denuclearization plans. When they're meeting at the place of the first nuclear blast in the world, and not to mention that one of the countries that committed it is now talking about denuclearization while making deals of sending nuclear submarines to a very problematic conflict zone in the world.
yeah.
Shows that their whole thing is without substance. They really do not intend to walk the talk on many of these matters, but make statements of blaming other countries for the problems around the world.
Mm. Perhaps all of which has led to, like you were pointing out, Anish, the New York Times labeling this the club for unloved leaders, and in that context, another sort of indicator of the confused nature of things is Biden cancelling his trip to Papua New Guinea, where he was to meet 18 regional leaders, the first time a sitting US president would ever have set foot on the soil of that country. Um, because of course, domestic issues in the United States with regards to the debt ceiling and things like that, which I think we should talk about on Daily Debrief at some point in the coming week for sure. But how big? On the one hand, you're saying you want to counter the influence of China in the Pacific, in Africa, and on the other hand, you are clearly sending out a message that my domestic audience is still far ahead of anything else.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the approval ratings of each of the leaders of the G7 summit at the point and some of the invitees as well, it's like they have really hit rock bottom. In some of the cases, it's like one of the worst historically speaking. So, at such a, it is the whole New York Times headline is quite apt in the way that it is just a club of very unpopular leaders, very unloved leaders, in acting in a sort of a support group, maybe, if we can joke about that. But necessarily speaking, it shows that their domestic issues are far bigger for them, definitely, and their whole positioning when it comes to China, when it comes to Ukraine, is to whip up certain kind of maybe nationalist or certain kind of anti-communist or anti-socialist frenzy back home, and maybe profit or exploit out of it for their maybe elections
Yeah.
in the coming years, and that is at the heart of it. The fact that the Pacific Summit took a backseat, and it is quite interesting how the US, the whole debt ceiling came at a very opportune or an inopportune moment for the United States president. But the fact that the US president really cannot commit to a visit to the Pacific at a time when they keep harping about how they have to contain the influence of China in the region, when China keeps having summits with these leaders very often, like more often than at least the US ones, shows how their commitments to smaller countries, how much ever they want to talk about it, is really not that big, or they're incapable of following through them. And even with the security deal that we're talking about, that we see in the news recently with Papua New Guinea, might get signed in Hiroshima. The fact that it had to be moved all the way to the north of Pacific, just so that the US president can just finish it off before going back home and deal with the whole debt ceiling crisis that is looming over them, surely speaks volumes about the kind of priorities that the US has when it comes to some of its foreign policy partners or making allies in different regions, definitely. And it clearly shows how much weaker they stand when they are beleaguered back home. They can obviously talk about democracy, but the fact remains that they are inept in containing some very jarring crisis back home that somehow they are completely avoiding, and have focused far more on, say, foreign policy issues by whipping up nationalist frenzy. And that really speaks volumes about how things work in the whole the whole kind of conflict lines that they're trying to build as well in at the moment in the region.
Thanks, Anish. Because that will lead us very nicely into our next bit, where we're talking about another, of course, member of the cast at this gathering in Japan, India's Narendra Modi, who's also dealing with multiple issues back home, but today is also having to watch images on television of an opposition government taking oath, swearing in the southern state of Karnataka. We've covered the election results briefly on Daily Debrief when they happened. But today we're going to be talking about Karnataka once again from the perspective of the show of unity that India's opposition has kind of put out in the lead up, of course, to the 2024 general elections that are scheduled in what is one of the world's largest functioning electoral democracies. Pragya will be joining us in studio to talk a bit more about what the imagery and the optics, of course, indicate, but also the kind of challenges that Narendra Modi faces in India at this point, and what his government is doing, whether it's more of what Anish was talking about, whipping up nationalist and other kind of emotional frenzies in some sort of hopes of remaining politically relevant, or is there a more sort of or some kind of a pivot in the political strategy. Pragya, we spoke after the election results were known. Of course, I mean, it's easy enough to understand how a far right ideology and others would be different where a campaign is concerned. But now that it has come to the stage of forming the government and moving ahead, what is the Congress promising to do differently, and do you see that sort of on the cards?
Yeah, Siddhant, so one of the things that's become a norm in Indian politics now is, that big event to announce that you're going to form the government. And that's when you call everybody who, is your supporter or your partner, or you expect them to be on the same side as you, before a big election, which is coming next year in India. So that's what the Congress has done. But against the backdrop of this grand sort of alliance they're showing now the campaign has ended, but another campaign seems to have begun for the 2024 Lok Sabha election, the general election in India. Underpinning all of this is basically the performance of the government over the next few months. And they made 5 big promises. The promises essentially seek to undo some of the effects of the economic policies and social policies of the previous governments that have ruled over the state of Karnataka.
Right.
It's a wealthy state, and the Congress party, which has won the election, is being roundly criticized for having announced these 5 policies, which involve an outflow of, essentially cash. Cash which will be put into the hands of people who don't have jobs, cash which will be put into the hands of women who need that money to tide over very high inflation, cash which will help people wait and apply for jobs until they get them.
Yeah.
So, there's no question that the state of Karnataka can afford the bill. But
so temporary assistance to people who need, essentially.
it is temporary assistance in many of these 5 promises are not going to exist forever, but they need to make a provision. They have promised that in principle they have already said that we've cleared this project. We have to also remember that the previous government ruling over Karnataka had a very socially divisive sort of set of policies. And one of the things that the Congress party has promised was to ban or bar the Bajrang Dal, a Hindutva outfit, a Hindu nationalist outfit, which is responsible for creating a lot of ruckus in the state along religious lines. They target the Muslims, they target the Christians.
Right.
It's been very difficult time for the minorities in that state. So we also have to see, apart from the economic policies, how they handle the social policies. But right now, this norm of celebrating your victory in an election, bringing all the opposition parties together, the parties that oppose the Hindutva nationalist BJP, it was bound to happen. There is no reason to think that these parties would lose out on that opportunity. They got this chance and they have taken it. And its signal will definitely go out to the rest of the country, where a lot of people are on tenterhooks already about the outcome of the result. You asked me about how a right-wing government and a left-wing or any other kind of government would be different.
Center, I suppose.
The Congress is definitely on the center. The biggest difference would be if they actually alter the social policies.
Right.
Yes, the economic relief will mean a lot to people.
Yeah, but those probably aspects are similar on both sides.
Right, even the right-wing BJP promises economic uplift. It's another matter
Schemes to help the poor.
Right.
Okay, we'll move on to the big picture that you were talking about, Pragya, which is of course the 2024 general elections. It's a message, of course, to the BJP, which is the party in power and the force against which all of these others are contending. But is it also a message to other coalition partners? What does the current sort of alliance look like, and how sort of what part of the political spectrum does it occupy?
Right, it occupies a very wide swath of the ideological spaces, but today's inauguration of the new government in Karnataka had, the left. They had the CPIM's Sitaram Yechuri, they had the CPI's, Communist Party of India's D. Raja. They had prominent leaders who are, who have nationalist in the party name, who have secular in the party name. There are chief ministers who are leading various Congress states where Congress won elections. There's a very wide number of allies of the Congress in different states, and also political parties and their chiefs with whom the Congress party might find itself contesting for the same group of people for their votes in 2024. Now, the thing is that in Karnataka itself, you probably see the rumblings of how the election next year will pan out, because you see the Bharatiya Janata Party has become a force to reckon with. There's no doubt about the kind of votes they got, 35%, pretty much holding on to what they had the last time, though they've lost terribly to the Congress. Now, the Congress Party took voters away in many parts of the state from the Janata Dal Secular, which is a regional party. So, as a result, you will find over the next few weeks, possibly that a lot of parties will think that maybe they should ally with the Congress to gain from it. And some will think that they need to distance themselves from it, and that the Congress should, learn to adjust with their voters and not cut into those vote shares. We've also seen some parties, one or two parties, actually turn a little hostile towards the Congress because of this opposition unity. But all that aside, the fact is that this is a big moment for all parties that hope to do well in next year's election. It's a big moment for those parties which think that the Congress Party, being the largest national party after the ruling party, should lead that sort of a alliance of partners, political partners. That alliance hasn't taken shape yet, but the Congress Party is still poised to be the biggest national party or the second biggest national party, depending on how that election turns out. So we will see a lot of jostling for power and a lot of adjustment at the regional level, largely because the Congress has shown that it can take votes away from regional parties and do well itself, and at the same time demonstrate that you do need a large national party to fight another large national party. So, I mean, it's going to be very complicated, but this is a moment of a victory, which is not surprising. The big show of opposition unity is not just a show. It's bound to energize those people who felt that the BJP was an unbeatable force just 3 years ago or 2 years ago.
All right, interesting times, definitely. Pragya. Busy times for you, and so we hope for regular updates on Daily Debrief, of course. Which also brings us to an end for this week's coverage of the news and other things on the show from us at Daily Debrief. We'll be back with another episode on Monday. Until then, have a decent weekend if you can. Stay safe. Don't forget to follow us on the social media platform of your choice. And if you have time for a bit of weekend reading, head to our website, peoplesdispatch.org. We'll see you on Monday. Goodbye.